World War II marked the debut of jet-powered aircraft in combat. By the war's end, several nations had fielded operational jets in roles from high-speed interceptors to experimental fighters. Among these pioneering machines, two stood out: the German Messerschmitt Me 262 and Britain's Gloster Meteor. These twin-engine jets were broadly comparable in purpose, both intended as fighter interceptors, yet they never met in battle. Since 1945, aviation enthusiasts have often wondered how Europe's first combat jets and America's shooting star would stack up head-to-head. Today, we delve into the development, capabilities, and combat performance of the Me 262 and Meteor to see which of these trailblazing fighters had the edge, and in what ways. Both Germany and Britain began exploring turbojet technology in the late 1930s, albeit on different paths. In Britain, visionary engineer Frank Whittle's work led to the first British jet aircraft, the Gloster E-28/39 demonstrator, which flew in May 1941. This proof of concept paved the way for a twin-engine fighter designed by Gloster. The result was the Meteor, a straight-winged mid-wing jet interceptor conceived in 1940 and first flown on the 5th of March 1943. Conservative in design and using centrifugal flow turbojets, the Meteor was aerodynamically conventional, but deemed promising enough that the Royal Air Force ordered it into production under wartime urgency. Meanwhile, in Germany, jet development was already in motion before the war. The Heinkel HE-178 had achieved the world's first jet flight in August 1939. Around the same time, Messerschmitt began early design studies for what would become the Me 262, later known as Project 1065, though serious development didn't begin until early 1940. The Messerschmitt team opted for an innovative approach: a sleek airframe with slightly swept wings and slim axial flow turbojet engines. Initially BMW 003s, later Junkers Jumo 004s. The Me 262's first powered flights in 1941 and 42 revealed great potential, but the project encountered repeated delays. Germany's early war confidence meant funding and materials for jets were not prioritized. In 1940, Luftwaffe chief Hermann Göring actually slashed jet engine research funding, believing conventional piston fighters would win the war quickly. This decision, along with directives for Willy Messerschmitt to keep his focus on Bf 109 production, stalled the 262's development at a critical time. Political interference further hampered the Me 262. Adolf Hitler became interested in the jet only in late 1943, by which time the air war situation was desperate. Hitler famously insisted the Me 262 be adapted into a Schnellbomber, fast bomber, rather than purely a fighter. Throughout 1944, this fighter bomber priority caused production and deployment confusion. Despite these hurdles, the first Me 262s entered service in mid-1944, making the Schwalbe or Swallow the world's first operational jet fighter, narrowly beating the Meteor's debut. The Me 262's initial combat missions began in July to August 1944, with Erprobungskommando 262 and then Jagdgeschwader 7, Germany's first jet fighter wing. On 26 July 1944, a Me 262 made the first jet versus aircraft engagement, intercepting but not downing an RAF Mosquito. Soon after, Me 262s were tangling with Allied bomber streams. In one notable action on the 18th of March 1945, Me 262s shot down a dozen US bombers in a single sortie. Britain's Gloster Meteor entered service a few weeks after the 262. The Meteor F1 was delivered to number 616 Squadron RAF on the 12th of July 1944. However, the RAF was so cautious about its new secret weapon that Meteor pilots were initially forbidden from flying over enemy territory. Instead, the first Meteors were used on home soil to counter the V-1 flying bomb attacks. In late July 1944, Meteor F-1s began intercepting V-1s, and on the 4th of August 1944, a Meteor scored its first kill by tipping a V-1 off course with its wing after the jet's guns jammed. By early 1945, improved Meteor F-3 models equipped with Rolls-Royce Derwent 1 engines were coming online. a detachment of Meteor F-3s deployed to Belgium in January 1945 to help protect Allied forces from German jets. Uniquely, these Meteors were painted all white to avoid misidentification by Allied pilots, who might mistake them for Me-262s at a glance. In the end, the Meteors did not encounter Me-262s in combat. The RAF's jets focused on downing V-1 missiles and stayed clear of offensive sweeps where German jets roamed. The war in Europe ended before the two fighters ever faced each other in the air. It remains a tantalizing what-if of aviation history. To evaluate the Gloster Meteor against the Me-262, it's fair to compare the wartime variants of each, principally the Meteor F-3 versus the Me-262A1A. Despite being slower on paper, the Meteor had several key advantages. Engine reliability and throttle response. The Meteor's power jets, W2 Welland and later Derwent centrifugal turbojets, were far more robust than the 262's Jumo 004 engines. British engines benefited from better high-temperature alloys and more development time, yielding a service life exceeding 100 hours in early Meteors. In contrast, a Jumo 004B often lasted only 20 to 50 hours before needing replacement. The Jumo's fragile turbine blades and lack of strategic metals meant frequent failures. Rapid throttle changes could even cause flameouts or engine fires. This slow spool-up plagued Me-262 pilots. If they shoved the throttle forward too quickly to evade attackers, the engines could stall. Allied airmen learned to exploit this by attacking Me-262s during takeoff or landing, when the German jets were at low power and couldn't accelerate away quickly. The Meteor's engines, while not without issues, were more forgiving and easier to maintain. As a result, Meteors had a higher availability rate and fewer in-flight engine mishaps than their German counterparts. Ease of maintenance and production. The Gloster Meteor was a more practical wartime design. Its centrifugal engines, though bulkier and less advanced than the Jumo 004s, were simpler to produce and maintain. The Meteor F-3's Derwent 1 engines each produced about 2,000 pounds of thrust, roughly on par with the Jumo 004B, 1,980 pounds, but without the finicky temperament. A post-war test at Britain's RAE Farnborough found that if both aircraft had engines of equal thrust, the Meteor 3 would still be about 20 miles per hour slower due to higher aerodynamic drag, but it enjoyed better handling and shorter takeoffs thanks to its wing design. In operational service, the Meteor's sturdy, conservative build meant fewer breakdowns. Ground crews could refuel, rearm, and turn around Meteors faster and with less specialized effort than the more complex 262. This reliability meant a higher ratio of Meteors could actually fight at any given time. It was estimated that by spring 1945, a large fraction of nominal Me-262s sat grounded for lack of spare parts or engine replacements. Maneuverability and high-altitude performance. With its broad straight wings and lower wing loading, the Meteor was more maneuverable at medium and low speeds. RAF evaluations noted the Meteor had superior turning capability and a shorter takeoff run than the Me-262. Though neither first-generation jet was a dogfighter like a Spitfire, a Meteor pilot in a low-speed turning contest could potentially get the upper hand. The Meteor also had a higher service ceiling, around 42,000 to 43,000 feet in wartime configuration, versus roughly 37,000 to 38,000 feet for the 262. This was partly due to the Meteor's engines retaining thrust at altitude and not flaming out as easily. In theory, a Meteor could loom above and force a Me-262 to climb into thinner air where the German jet's performance waned. The RAF actually contemplated using Meteors to intercept high-flying reconnaissance aircraft for this reason. Better pilot visibility and fire control. The Meteor's cockpit sat further forward with a clear view, whereas the Me-262's cockpit was set back between the engines, limiting forward-downward vision over its long nose. Meteor pilots also benefited from British gyro-stabilized gun sights. By late 1944, many Meteors were equipped with the cutting-edge Mark II gyro gun sight, which computed target lead on moving enemies, a significant aid for jet speed combat. The Me-262's RV-16B reflector gun sight lacked such technology. This gave Meteor pilots an accuracy edge, especially when engaging fast-moving or evasive targets. In one account, a Meteor F-3 pilot easily destroyed a drone target at speed thanks to the gyro sight, a feat that would have been much harder with a traditional sight. Combined with the Meteor's 4 nose-mounted 20mm Hispano cannons with high-velocity shells, it was well suited to tracking and hitting agile targets. Numbers and operational flexibility. While not a design feature per se, it's worth noting the Allies' ability to deploy Meteors in meaningful numbers by 1945. Over 200 Meteor F1 and F3s were delivered by war's end, and production was accelerating. These were used not only in the UK against V1 bombs, but also deployed on the continent in early 1945 for air defence. In contrast, Germany managed to produce around 1,400 Me-262s, but due to shortages and Allied bombings, only about 200 to 300 ever became operational at once. Allied control of the air and adequate fuel supplies meant Meteors could be used more freely. The RAF even experimented with Meteors for photo reconnaissance and gun-laying observation. The Meteor's reliability and the Allied logistics advantage ensured that if the war had dragged on, the RAF could field far more jets and keep them combat-ready. In short, the Meteor was simpler, sturdier and more reliable. A jet fighter that, while not as fast or futuristic as the Me-262, could be counted on to perform day in and day out with fewer failures. The Meteor gave the RAF a jet it could use reliably, and that was a non-trivial advantage in wartime. The Messerschmitt 262 was an engineering marvel for its time, and it retained several important advantages over the Meteor. Pure speed and acceleration. The Me-262 was the fastest aircraft of World War II, powered by 2 axial-flow Jumo 004B turbojets producing nearly 2,000 pounds thrust each. A typical Me-262A1A could reach about 540 to 559 miles per hour in level flight. This was roughly 100 to 150 miles per hour faster than the early Meteors in service. The Meteor F1 topped out around 410 miles per hour, and the F3 around 450 to 480 miles per hour. In practice, that meant a 262 could dictate the terms of an engagement. It could engage or disengage at will. Captain Eric Brown, a renowned British test pilot who flew the Me-262, regarded it as the most formidable aircraft of World War II, noting that its speed allowed pilots to engage or disengage from combat at will. Acceleration was another edge. The 262's thrust-to-weight ratio, while hampered by engine limits, was still sufficient for brisk climbs and quick dives. US Army Air Force tests comparing a captured Me-262 to the new American P-80 Shooting Star concluded the German jet was superior in speed and acceleration, though climb rate was similar. Simply put, if a Me-262 pilot spotted a Meteor, he could likely outrun and outclimb the British jet at most altitudes. The Meteor's advantage in low-altitude agility would be of little comfort if the 262 zoomed away to set up another attack on its own terms. High-speed aerodynamics. The Me-262's airframe was years ahead of its Allied counterparts. Its wings had a subtle 18.5-degree sweep, and it featured smooth laminar flow wing profiles and automatic leading-edge slats, like those on Messerschmitt Bf-109s, to delay stall at high speeds. This gave the 262 a higher critical Mach number. It could approach the transonic region in a dive more safely than the straight-wing Meteor, which encountered buffeting and loss of control as it neared Mach 0.8. Unlike the Meteor, which required air brake flaps above and below the wings to remain controllable in steep dives, the 262 could dive faster without such devices and without immediate risk of compressibility loss of control. German pilots capitalized on this by using steep diving attacks. They developed the slashing attack technique, diving diagonally through Allied bomber formations at extreme speed, then zooming back up, a tactic that the Meteor, with its lower speed and lack of dive brakes in early marks, would have struggled to counter. At higher speeds and altitudes, the 262 was simply the better handler. One RAF combat report noted that beyond 20,000 feet and 450 miles per hour, a Meteor became sluggish, whereas the 262 remained responsive. The Me-262's overall aerodynamic refinement, including a clean fuselage and well-shaped engine nacelles, gave it an edge in any scenario where raw speed and high-speed stability mattered. Firepower and multi-role capability. The standard Me-262A1A was armed with 430mm Mk-108 cannons in the nose, a devastating armament designed to shred heavy bombers. In contrast, the Meteor F1 and F3 carried 420mm Hispano Mark V cannons. The Mk-108 had about 3 to 4 times the per-shell destructive power of a 20mm, and a single hit could down a fighter or cripple a bomber. In one late war test, A Me-262 pilot downed a B-24 Liberator with just a short burst from these guns. However, this firepower came with caveats. The 30mm shells had a low muzzle velocity, around 540 meters per second, compared to the Hispano's 880 meters per second. This meant Me-262 pilots had to shoot with significant lead, especially against maneuvering fighters, a difficult prospect at jet closing speeds. Still, in a head-on pass or against a non-maneuvering target, the 262's firepower was unparalleled. Moreover, the 262 was versatile. Variants and field modifications saw 262s equipped with rockets, such as R4M unguided rockets under the wings for bomber attacks, bombs, Me-262A2A Sturmvogel fighter bomber carrying up to 500 kilograms of ordnance, and even radar for night fighting, the two-seat Me-262B1AU1 with radar antennae. By late 1944-45, the Me-262 was serving as an interceptor, a ground attacker, and a reconnaissance platform. While the Meteor could have been adapted similarly, indeed post-war Meteors carried rockets and bombs in ground attack roles, during World War II, the Meteor was used strictly as a day fighter. The German jet, out of sheer necessity, demonstrated a multi-role flexibility that the Meteor didn't exploit until later. In short, the 262 was a more ambitious design, not just a fighter, but potentially a fighter-bomber and night fighter as well. This offered the Luftwaffe more tactical options. For example, high-speed bombing of bridges, as attempted against the Remagen Bridge in March 1945, albeit unsuccessfully. The Meteor, by comparison, was kept on a tight leash, never tasked beyond simple interception duties before victory in Europe Day. Advanced technology. Technologically, the Me-262 introduced features that would shape the next generation of fighters. Its axial flow turbojet engines were the template for all subsequent jet engines. The Meteor's centrifugal flow engines, while reliable, were a dead-end design by the 1950s. The swept-wing concept of the 262, though modest in sweep, presaged the dramatic performance leap seen in post-war jets like the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15. In fact, the North American F-86's engineers borrowed heavily from German research on swept wings and even incorporated slat designs inspired by the 262. Even the tricycle landing gear of the 262 was ahead of some early Meteors. The first Meteor prototype had a tailwheel. In essence, the Me-262 was pointing the way toward the true jet-age fighters of the 1950s. Had the war continued, or had Germany not been resource-starved, the 262's design had more headroom for improvement, higher thrust engines, better high-speed controls, etc. This is speculative, but one can imagine an Me-262 with improved engines and systems would age better in combat against early Cold War jets than a straight-wing Meteor could. In pure aerodynamics and innovation, the 262 was the superior machine. It was Germany's inability to fully realize that potential that held it back. In sum, the Me-262 was faster, harder hitting, and aerodynamically superior. A German jet pilot entering combat in 1944-45 had, in the 262, an aircraft 5 years ahead of any Allied fighter in concept. The 262 could engage enemy aircraft on its own terms, using energy tactics, boom and zoom attacks, high-speed passes, where it was essentially untouchable. These qualities made it a truly revolutionary weapon, albeit one introduced too late to change Germany's fate. If a Meteor F-3 squadron and a Me-262A-1A Staffel had met in combat, the outcome would have hinged on tactics and context. Both aircraft brought cutting-edge jet performance to the skies, but also suffered from first-generation limitations. A dogfight between them would not mirror piston-era turn fights. It would likely consist of fleeting high-speed passes, with each pilot seeking momentary advantage. The 262 would usually have the initiative. With a top speed significantly higher than the Meteors, it could choose when and how to engage. German pilots would exploit speed to conduct slashing attacks, diving, firing, then climbing or extending away before the Meteor could react. Its 4 30mm cannons could inflict catastrophic damage with a short burst, especially against slower-moving or straight-flying targets. Meteor pilots would depend on coordinated tactics, using loose formations to maintain visual contact, turning into attacks to force overshoots, and exploiting the Meteor's tighter turning radius at lower speeds. While the Meteor lacked the acceleration to chase a 262, it could outturn it if the German jet slowed down too much. Its 4 20mm cannons, with flatter trajectories, were highly effective if a firing solution could be achieved. In the vertical plane, the 262 retained an edge in zoom climbs, though the Meteor could operate slightly higher, 42,000 versus 37,000 feet ceiling, giving it limited altitude advantage in some scenarios. However, the Meteor's top-end speed remained lower, and in level flight or shallow dives it could not catch a 262. The only realistic way to force engagements was to intercept the 262 during takeoff or landing, when it was slow and vulnerable, mirroring tactics used successfully by Allied piston fighters. While the 262 was tactically superior, faster, more heavily armed, and capable of choosing its fights, the Meteor had the advantage in reliability, serviceability, and overall sortie rate. In a prolonged campaign, this could tilt operational effectiveness in the RAF's favor. Despite the 262's impressive kill tally, many of its victories were against bombers or unescorted aircraft, and Allied fighters, including slower piston types, were still able to bring them down by exploiting their vulnerabilities. At the end of the day, the Me-262 may have dominated in performance, but the Meteor offered better operational sustainability. If the war had continued into late 1945, a Meteor versus 262 contest would have been shaped not only by technology, but by tactics, numbers, and the ability to keep aircraft flying. When assessing which was better, we must define better for what. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the more advanced aircraft, a quantum leap in aircraft technology whose performance stunned the Allies. It introduced design concepts that would become standard in later fighters. In raw combat capability, speed, climb, firepower, the 262 holds the advantage over the Meteor Mark III. It was able to outrun anything in the sky in 1944 and 45. In hypothetical one-on-one combat, especially at higher altitudes or in boom and zoom engagements, the 262 should prevail more often than not. However, the 262's brilliance was undercut by its operational shortcomings. It was a thoroughbred racehorse that spent more time in the repair stable than on the track. Engines that lasted a dozen hours, acute fuel shortages, and an overtaxed German logistical network meant many 262s never reached their potential. The aircraft was also introduced in an increasingly unfavorable environment. By 1944-45, the Luftwaffe lacked veteran pilots and couldn't properly train new ones for the demanding 262. As General Galland lamented, they were throwing green pilots with just a few jet hours into an aircraft that even experts found tricky at the limits. The Gloster Meteor, by contrast, was the more practical and dependable warplane. It was a conservative design that proved robust and adaptable. While it never had the chance to shine in aerial duels during World War II, it did perform the jobs asked of it, intercepting V-1 missiles and deterring any potential high-altitude threats. The British approach of not overtasking the Meteor and guarding its secret meant it survived the war without the trial by fire that the 262 endured. In a prolonged war scenario, the Meteor's reliability and the Allied production capacity would have been crucial. By mid-1945, the RAF would field hundreds of Meteors, whereas Germany's 262 force was dwindling due to attrition and lack of spares. Sheer numbers and serviceability could tip the balance in the Meteor's favor over time. There is also the question of evolution. The Meteor had far more development ahead of it. The wartime F3 gave way to the Meteor F4 and F8 in rapid succession, each with more powerful engines and refined aerodynamics. By 1946, a Meteor F4 set a world speed record of 606 miles per hour, finally surpassing the 262's top speed. The Meteor F8 became a capable frontline fighter of the early 1950s, though still outclassed by newer swept-wing jets. The 262, on the other hand, saw only limited post-war development. A small number were built in Czechoslovakia as the Avia S-92, but they served briefly before being retired by 1951. The 262's design, while inspirational to others, was not carried forward by any major air force. In essence, the Meteor had a longer legacy, serving into the mid-1950s with multiple air forces and even seeing significant combat in the Korean War, whereas the 262 was a dead end in terms of operational service. The Meteor's operational life extended well beyond the war. It was adopted by multiple air forces and upgraded into several improved variants. Most notably, the Meteor F8 saw combat during the Korean War with No. 77 Squadron RAAF. There, it was initially deployed in the air superiority role but was soon outmatched by the faster, swept-wing MiG-15s. After sustaining losses, the Meteors were reassigned to ground attack duties, a reflection of how quickly jet technology had evolved. The 262, though briefly manufactured post-war in Czechoslovakia, had no comparable combat legacy. In the end, the Me-262 stood out as the more revolutionary design, but the Meteor was the more successful and enduring operational aircraft. While the 262 pushed the technological envelope, the Meteor survived, adapted, and helped carry its operators into the jet age.